Love them or hate them, gnomes create a lot of strong opinions in the D&D community. I mean, it's true that gnomes are eccentric, and some people argue that their innate sense of curiosity doesn't make sense with their racial backgrounds. They're too goofy, they just don't take the game world seriously enough. Respectfully, this video is a counterargument to the idea that gnomes are not a rich, well-developed, and indispensable part of the Dungeons & Dragons world. Greetings, friends. I am the Common House Bard, and this is my defense of gnomes. So in one of my last videos, I jumped into the history of gnomes in the real world and why they fit so well into the D&D world. And in the research process, I came upon a very thoughtful and well-made video by the first Arcadian who argued that gnomes' innate sense of curiosity just didn't fit. Their innate curiosity just wasn't as supported by the text and the source material. I'll summarize it like this. Basically, gnomes being a long-lived race with insatiable curiosity, it wouldn't make sense that they weren't really more plugged into the comings and goings of the other folk. If it was a racial trait to be curious, then it just doesn't make sense that they aren't more ambitious or plugged into the geopolitics of the world, that they're being withdrawn just somehow doesn't mesh with this. That's more or less it. So I'm going to offer 4 solid explanations as to why innate curiosity makes sense for gnomes, and then I'm going to offer a 5th explanation that kind of explains a little more about what I think is a good fundamental approach to D&D philosophy. And perhaps it even explains why there seems to be no definitive background for gnomes available. Before I start, I just want to shout out the first Arcadian. The video was thoughtful, it was well made, and this counter argument is definitely not meant to be a I'm right, you're wrong situation. I'm just trying to offer an alternative view, maybe change your mind a little bit. Let me know what you think. Number 1, gnomes, they share a history of enslavement and violence. They've seen the ugliness that other creatures have to offer. Therefore, I attribute their curiosity and their innate sense to experience everything that life has to offer as an act of reclamation against the cold-heartedness of the other creatures living in the realm. It's the perfect answer to the chaos and indifference around them. As pointed out, they have long lives, so we all know the best revenge is through good living. And gnomes embody this. They want to live deep and suck out all the marrow of life. But living so long, you probably experience a lot of what the world has to offer. So naturally then, if you're determined to live well, curiosity is going to be a vital component in making sure that you're living an interesting life. So let's say, for example, that instead of it being a racial trait, let's call it a social compact. Gnomes all agree to be curious to get the best experience out of life. Because they want to live good, they use curiosity to take what is a collective trauma of their past and say that they refuse to be called by it. And if we're willing to theorize that gnomish curiosity is not necessarily only a racial trait, but a social compact, then I would offer my 2nd counter argument. It's going to take a minute to get there, but I will get there, so stick with me. I like to call this the you wouldn't hit a guy in glasses defense, or the court jester defense. The court jester is historically misunderstood. Everybody assumes that the fool in the royal court is just kind of a gibbering jester designed to poke fun at and make everybody laugh. But this isn't actually exclusively true. It's actually a pretty profoundly powerful role in royal society. The court jester did not have to adhere to most of the social rules of the court, putting them in a very unique position to speak truth to power to the royal power structure. Now, in order to speak truth to power, you have to remove yourself as a threat. You have to say, I am not interested in the throne, I'm not interested in power, I am not a threat. What does this have to do with curiosity? Well, I would argue that curiosity is the primary tool of understanding what makes people tick. And if you're going to avoid violence with a potential enemy, you need to understand how they think. You have to understand what kind of thing they would perceive as a threat, and then make sure you don't look like a threat. Perhaps in a quest to understand the motivations and machinations of those questing for geopolitical power, what they're really doing is learning how to make themselves seem non-threatening. And in fact, the text supports this idea. Only once did the gnomes ever develop anything that was considered kind of a power center or homeland for the gnomes, and that was the island of Lantan. And the thing is, they were actually really good at it. They were very successful at being power brokers, of consolidating power. And what happened the one time they stuck their heads out and decided to make a nice place for their own? The gods smacked them down with the spell plague. The whole island was just destroyed. Maybe a superstitious race of gnomes decided, hey, maybe our lot in life is not to seek power. It seems counterintuitive that curiosity might lead to being withdrawn, but in terms of using it as a tool of self-defense, it makes perfect sense. And that'll bring me to my third point, that perhaps this very sense of isolation explains the curiosity that's inherent in gnomes. Curiosity itself is not so much a racial trait as it is a counterbalance to being withdrawn and isolated by choice. It's their survival strategy. Take the idea that all the gnomes decide that being withdrawn and isolated is the best way to survive, then curiosity is going to be like the natural thing to crop up. I mean, imagine growing up under a fierce protectionism, but knowing that there was this dynamic, beautiful, magical world out there. Of course they're going to be curious. Of course they're all going to have this innate curiosity. What a good contradiction to play. Strangely, you would also think that if isolationism was self-defense, they would also have a pretty strong run of cowardice. But in fact, they don't. Which again, just leads me to believe that it's not through fear that they isolate, but through cold, calculated reasoning. They know they need to isolate to survive. They're not particularly happy with it, but they're choosing to do that. And curiosity is just a natural consequence of not seeing the big, beautiful world. And the reason that we have adventuring gnomes is because, try as they might, by Garl, sometimes their curiosity just gets the better of them. All right, number 4. Now, the First Arcadian argues that gnomes being withdrawn might actually be a part of their heightened intelligence, that they've somehow reached a higher level of enlightenment. And actually, I think you're onto something. This is used to explain their disinterest in the larger world, that they can't be bothered to engage in the petty squabbles of the short-lived folk. I actually think that's right, but First Arcadian's argument is that this seems inconsistent with natural curiosity. But honestly, I think it's perfectly consistent with natural curiosity. And so my argument is this. Just because they don't participate in geopolitics doesn't mean that they don't understand it or aren't paying attention. If they've reached an enlightened state of mind or have a higher natural intelligence, it could be that they are very much aware of it, but they just choose not to get involved. I mean, if you're watching squabbles erupt between warring tribes of short-lived creatures, it just seems like it would get old and tired. And when there's this incredibly rich and dynamic magical world out there, like, why concern yourself with the squabbles of others? I mean, we've all met that person who just wants to, like, shut themselves in a library and study. Like, it's not that they're disinterested. They're just interested in other things. Like, for example, if you're out for a hike and you see 2 squirrels fighting over a pine cone, are you going to stop to mediate between those 2 squirrels or to pick sides? Or are you just going to say, well, that's interesting, and then move on with your day? You're going to move on. And if you do, my friend, you are doing something quite gnomish. Being a creature of great longevity, you just have to imagine their psychology is different. To a human, a gnome might seem aloof or goofy, or that they're not taking a certain circumstance seriously enough. But it could be that they've just been thinking about this particular recipe for mushroom stew for the last several decades, and they've just had a breakthrough. What if I used marjoram instead of sage? You can't knock the microphone over, buddy. So my final argument is going to be a little out there, but stick with me because I think it gets to the heart of what D&D is all about. I view gnomes a lot like Lord of the Ring hobbits. And now, I hear what you're saying. Hobbits are a lot closer to halflings. But stick with me, I'm going somewhere with this. Now, in the Lord of the Rings, hobbits have no ambitions for geopolitics. They kind of live by themselves, isolated out in the middle of everywhere. But they're shrewd creatures. They stay out of fights. They don't go looking for adventure. And because of that, they're thriving. All through the series, the hobbits are held up as an example of what can be achieved through tranquility and peace. Like, they spent generations perfecting the art of smoking pipe weed and blowing rings. Like, that is a very gnomish thing, my friend. The hobbits of the Shire represent all that is good and peaceful and tranquil in Middle-earth. They're constantly being held up by all of the others in the Fellowship as exactly what we are fighting for. The reason that it's important to defeat Sauron. It is their values that make them worth fighting for. It is their character. They inspire others to be a better version of themselves. So if we take a prevailing look at the D&D world, it is chock full of negativity, evil, and corruption. I mean, even the title itself, Dungeons and Dragons, two things absolutely full of danger. And it's a rare gaming session that we don't encounter actual physical manifestations of evil and fight to the death. Gnomes balance the scales. They remind us that there are beautiful things in the world worth fighting for. It doesn't matter that they don't fight, they don't get involved. They're an example of something that is worth fighting for. And if after all of this, you're still skeptical and you just think, no, I'm not buying any of these arguments, I'm going to present one last thing. That if the gnome's history doesn't make sense with what is printed, then maybe it's on purpose. There is something to be said about the addition of mystery and the overall weave of the D&D universe. Maybe the fact that the history of gnomes in Dungeons and Dragons is cloudy is doing exactly what it was meant to do. It instills us with a sense of mystery. We live in an age of easy answers. We live where information is a click of a button away. I want to take you back to the first time you played D&D, when you weren't even sure that you'd stick with the game. When you encountered a couple of monsters the first couple of combats and you had no idea what they were or what they were going to do. What a thrill that was. The first time you encountered a dark mantle and you didn't know how to overcome magical darkness. Or the first time that your party encountered a rust monster that ate through your brand new set of chainmail that you'd spent 8 adventurers saving up for. Man, that mystery, that not knowing what was going to happen next, that's what kept us coming back for more. Maybe the thing about gnomes is we're just not supposed to know why they're curious. But it sure is fun. I encourage you to check out the First Arcadians channel, and specifically the video, The Problem with Gnomes. Even though, in a friendly way, I disagree with the premise of the video, it has some great stuff about gnomish character development. It has great history of gnomes in D&D, and it's a fun watch. There's also lots of cool stuff on his channel too, so consider subscribing. And hey, while you're at it, go ahead and subscribe here too. But first, a little fun fact about gnomes. Gnomish weddings last for at least a week. In fact, it's considered quite gauche if they last for shorter than that. Like, if that is not the perfect... Gnomish weddings are so much fun. If people left before that, it would be a huge source of embarrassment for the gnomish couple. Like, that's just cool. If that alone is not enough to convince you that gnomes represent all that's good and joyful in the D&D world, then, my friend, you may need to check your head for curses, hexes, and illithid parasites. I am the Common House Bard. The cat was Victor. And on behalf of us both, cheers.